All right, good afternoon. You're very welcome along to this Sunday's Sunday paper review here on Off the Ball. No show today on Off the Ball because the general election is taking over this afternoon on this Sunday afternoon, and I suppose probably in a bit of luck for us as well. One of our Premier League games would have been called off, Manchester City and West Ham this afternoon. But we are going to bring you a Sunday paper review because there's loads going on. Big interview with Rory McIlroy once again in the Sunday Independent. Lots of rugby coverage after Ireland's win in the Six Nations yesterday. Kieran Cunningham and Conor McKeon are alongside me this afternoon. Kieran of the Irish Daily Star and Conor McKeon of the Herald. We will start this afternoon by going through the back pages. We'll start on the Sunday Times. Picture of Andrew Conway here, breaking through, Ireland heading in the right direction with 24-14 bonus point win over Wales. Picture of Andrew Conway getting ready to shake off the challenge of Johnny McNicholl, touching down for the bonus point try in yesterday's 24-14 win against Wales at the Aviva Stadium. And on the right hand side of that page, Farrell. This is what Sexton does best. Andy Farrell heaping praise on Johnny Sexton after his performance yesterday. On the back page of the Sunday Independent, once again they are leading with on the top, Kiss of the Scorpion. It's an extract of Rory McIlroy's big interview with Paul Kimmage, which is in part 2 this afternoon, part 2 of 3. We spoke about last week's one on last week's Sunday paper review, and there's another week to come as well next week. And then below that, Reborn Ireland stormed to victory. Farrell's men set up triple crown bid after toppling the Grand Slam champions, and the picture of Andrew Conway diving over in the corner for the bonus point win yesterday afternoon. On the back of the Mail on Sunday, celebrations again with Andrew Conway alongside Ross Byrne and John Cooney after he scored the bonus point try. Taking power, Andy Farrell's men seized control of Six Nations with dominant dismissal of the champions. And below there at the bottom, Desi Drama, Dublin snatch draw after 9 minutes of added time. That was the 1:15 apiece draw between Dublin and Monaghan yesterday in the Alliance Football League. On the back page of the Sunday World, Gale Force win. I'm proud of this group of players. We need to realise we can get better. That's from Johnny Sexton. And they say, Storm Johnny ready to hit Twickers for Triple Crown. Ireland heading into a break week now in the Six Nations before going to Twickenham today, 2 weeks for a Triple Crown showdown against England. England beating Scotland by 10 points to 6, or by 13 points, I should say, to 6 yesterday. On the back of the Star this Sunday, Empire State of Mind. Marcus Rashford is holding talks over a multi-million-pound tie-up with Jay-Z's Rock Nation Sports Management Company. Rash's Jay-Z link-up. And then on the left side of the page, Faz is con his way. Thumping victories is so Andy for table toppers. A lot of puns in the space of 2 sentences there. On the back of the Irish Sun, Crown Prince, Sexton triple threat. Ireland 24, Wales 14. A picture of Johnny Sexton with a bit of a cut on his cheek, bloodied up. Sexton during win over Wales. Johnny Sexton wants a triple crown instead of a triple frown when Ireland take on England in a fortnight's time. And the back of the Sunday Mirror this week, Johnny, have some of that. Celebrations among the Irish players after, I think, an important scrum yesterday, a late penalty decision. A number of the Irish pack there. Johnny, have some of that. Sexton delighted, Dublin display. Ireland 24, Wales 14. And then City will sign stars if I'm here or not. Guardiola plays it cool over his future. So, Kieran and Conor, we're going to start this afternoon, as we did last week. Golf Sunday Independent, Paul Kimmage speaking to Rory McIlroy. What are our thoughts?
Okay, where do you start? One thing I've noticed the last few years is I think in a lot of newspaper features, the main days for features be Saturday and Sunday. A lot of newspaper features are too short, oftentimes in print, and often I see with online media a lot of features are far too long. That they need pruning.
It's the Netflix approach. Just because you can make an episode of TV an hour, you don't actually have to.
Yeah, they need a lot more pruning. And this, for a newspaper feature, if you consider that's gone over 3 weeks, it's going to be the guts of between 18 and 20,000 words, which is massive. And when you consider Paul, I think it was 2 years ago, did a 2-parter of similar length each Sunday with Rory McIlroy as well. He's probably has the guts of half a book out of the 5 weeks. And I think it would read better as a book, as part of a book. I think, to me, this would be stronger if they went with one hit and put all the best stuff into one Sunday over 6,000 words rather than spread it over 3. Because I think you're stretching Rory McIlroy is a fascinating figure. He's the biggest Irish star on the planet, and he's arguably he's close and arguably the greatest Irish sports person ever. You can make a very strong case for him. So he's somebody that's very interesting. But I do think with readers often a kind of I'm always wary of running interviews over more than one day. I sometimes think it can work in a daily when it's the following day, say part 2 tomorrow, but to stretch it over 3 weeks is stretching it a little bit. I understand, I know independent.ie, a paywall is coming very shortly, and I think the last section of this next week will be in the print edition, but if you want to read it online, you'll have to pay to go behind the paywall. And I would say this is partly a business decision, that they want to build this up, and this is the final part of the interview next week. You have to go behind the paywall. But I know it might be an odd thing to say, but I thought there was just too much golf in it. And I wouldn't be as much of a golf nut as Paul.
If Joe Malloy was sitting in this chair as he normally does on a Sunday afternoon,
I talked to Joe before, and
very little hurling in it.
Yeah, very little hurling. But like Conor would
Nothing
be more
on the Dubs either.
Conor would be far more interested in golf with me. But like this, even the stuff that's non-golf, like he goes into at the start the books that he reads, and that I find that they're basically self-help books and motivational books. I'd find it more interesting if he was reading Stalingrad by Anthony Beevor or James Joyce Ulysses or something, or the collected poems of Pat Inglesby or something just off the wall. But he was kind of reading what I expect golfers to read. It didn't surprise me, this piece. That's being honest, But I think I'd really enjoyed if it was part of a book that Paul did with Rory rather than an interview.
I have to say, I find that part of it. I've actually, all the pieces that I've that I've marked are those books, and the reason being that I play golf at a very low level, and I'm in a golf club with a lot of people, and they read these books. And you sort of assume that somebody who's trying to get their handicap from 12 to 8 is going to read these books. And the assumption would be that Rory McIlroy doesn't need to read this book.
He doesn't need to shave a couple of points off the handicap.
No, but I suppose the function, or the reason that the way this has been done, it's not just a long feature that's been chronologically chopped into 3 sections. The theme of this is what changed about Rory McIlroy, because it's 5 years, and the way Paul approaches this, I think, is like they say that lawyers never ask a question that they don't already know the answer to. Well, journalists suffer from the opposite affliction, but you get the impression in this that Paul has done so much research on Rory McIlroy that he's actually leading him into telling the story that Paul wants him to tell, which is what changed about his game, what changed about him as a person. And it's a familiar story with sports people, that when they're young and carefree and not mentally scarred by any sort of traumatic event in their thing, they just keep going. And McIlroy looked in 2014 like he was going to challenge Tiger Woods, Jack Nicklaus, all those players. And he hasn't won a major in 5 years. And a lot of things happened over those 5 years. He was engaged, the engagement broke off, he got married, he had a back injury, he changed caddies, he changed equipment manufacturers, all the sort of things that even if one of them happened, it can be quite disruptive. And I think what Paul Kimmage is doing today is he's getting Rory McIlroy to tell the story of, because he's now world number 1. He was world number 2 when this interview was done. So he's obviously come back the other side. And the whole point, I think, of this interview, or certainly the narrative that it gives us, is how he got back to being a competitive golfer. Like, unfortunately for Rory McIlroy, he's always judged against majors. But last year he won the Tour Championship. He won 5 times on the PGA Tour. That's an extraordinary. He won the FedEx. That's a $15 million event. So he was extraordinarily successful last year. So much so that Brooks Koepka, the major winning machine, he just went past him in the world rankings last year. So he had a really, really good year. But smack bang in the middle of this year, and it's hinted at in teasers, both of those, the last 2 weeks, is what happened in Portrush. And the question that Kimmage asks here is the tee shot on the first hole in Portrush. Where does that sit in the choking thing? And McIlroy sort of rejects it out of hand. He says, look, choking is what happens when, like he used an example of himself, Augusta 2011,
yeah. Adam Scott has run the following year in the Open.
Yeah. And the question is, was that a choke? And he says there's a difference. I don't want to give too much away about it, but I suppose in quoting all these books, like, the subtle art of not giving a fuck, and so the obstacle is in the way, all these sort of, self-help books or whatever you want to call them, the slow reveal is of a Rory McIlroy who's much more self-reflective, who's much more micro-analytical of how it is that he is a good golfer, rather than the instinctive golfer that we used to see in his youth when he was collecting major titles. And I think what comes across here is that works both ways. In analysing what he was going to do on the first tee shot in Portrush for the previous year, he never once put himself in the psychological mind frame of what the walk to the first tee was going to be like and how that was going to affect him. And it was literally one tee shot that completely ruined his entire tournament, and possibly the major for which he'll always be remembered, regardless of what he goes on to win. And the piece sort of ends with, we're going back to Portrush here.
Tease it up for next week again.
So it'll be interesting. But what I will say is, if you find golf interesting, and I do, and if you find Rory McIlroy interesting, and I do, the level of detail in here is fascinating. But, as Kieran says, I hope Rory McIlroy never does an autobiography with anybody other than Paul Kimmage now at this stage, because I don't know what he's going to talk about.
Yeah, he's done the groundwork, Paul. Yeah, because I was part of the judging panel last year for RTE Sportsperson of the Year, and the meeting we had, to come up with a long list and then cut the long list to a short list of 10. And then Shane Lowry ended up winning the overall award, which was no surprise. Like, everybody saw that coming. But I remember there was a debate over whether Rory was on the long list and whether there was a debate whether he should be in the short list. And my argument was that if anybody else had done what he'd done last year, there would be no question, and he might well have been Sportsperson of the Year. But the argument was made by somebody else, and it was a persuasive one, that because in his own mind he wouldn't have felt that it was justified, because he is judging himself by the higher standards, like far higher standards than we're used to in Irish sport. He's judging himself on the highest global standards and the highest historical standards of golf, and by that criteria he knows that 5-year gap is there. He knows what happened in Portrush, and he does get up like
he had to tee off on the Sunday in Augusta. He teed off on the 10th hole, which is like,
that's slap in the face.
If there's ever a sign that you're not on your game.
Yeah, because Paul quotes, what Brandel Chambly said after his first round of the Open, and basically saying, the word is choking. We shy away from it, but now it's 5 years since he hasn't won a major. Basically, he's a choker. And Rory challenges that and said, no, it's more a fear of failure. You can't choke on the first day.
Yeah.
But I think you can.
Chambly citing the fact that he has this history of playing himself out of a tournament on day 1 or 2 and making the big charge over the weekend when the pressure's off. And it's even earlier in it when he refers to, he gets the longest thrown around about the number of backdoor top 10s he gets.
Yeah.
How, at the end of the week it looks good. He's there tied 5th or 10th or in that position, but he was never
See, the pressure's
contending.
off. I think you can choke on the first day or the first tee, because if you're making a late charge then the last couple of days when you're really out of the running, the pressure's off. The pressure was on big time at the very start. So you can argue that he choked out. And I think, like, this strikes me, like, golfers to me are the most self-obsessed sports people of all.
And you probably have to be, I think.
Yeah, you probably have to get, because at the level they get to and the detail of their game demands that amount of introspection and demands that amount of reading and that amount of mental training, I think. But I think he knows that that's a flaw, that it's got to him in the first day, that the pressure got to him in the first day. And people hate the word choking. Like, it's one of the biggest insults that can be thrown at you in sport. And I think that's why he shies away from there. But saying the fear of failure is saying the same thing. It's saying the same thing in different language. Like, I think he's admitting there's a problem.
Yeah, choking, like, it's totally loaded, because it's a stain on your character as opposed to some sort of technical failing. The whole piece is kind of, the parable that's used here is the scorpion and the frog. It's been tagged all week. But I think one of the more interesting thing is they talk about last year in the Tour Championship, the tournament that Tiger won his first win on the PGA Tour in however long. And he was playing with McIlroy, and it was one of those. It was one of those, and they happened a lot last season. Sorry, not last season, 2018, where McIlroy was in contention and then faded on the final day. And they talk about here how McIlroy tried to engage Tiger in conversation during the round, and they would be close, like they know each other very well. They're the same equipment manufacturer and everything else. And Tiger basically, you know, the icy stare came up. And McIlroy admits in this saying, well, look, there are times when I can be the scorpion, but more naturally, I'm the frog. And that's interesting because in 2014, Shane Ryan wrote that brilliant book about slaying the tiger.
Yeah.
And, but he used the example of, I think it's McIlroy's last major in Valhalla in 2014. And there was a big delay. If you remember, McIlroy finished in the dark.
With Mickelson
and
Ricky Fowler, yeah.
And there was a big delay, and the three golfers were standing on the tee, and Ricky Fowler and Mickelson were interacting with each other, and they were kind of making jokes or whatever. And McIlroy sat within a few feet of them, within earshot, and he stared icily ahead. So it's funny how there's a kind of a
there always
a hierarchy, you know, as in when McIlroy is taking on Phil Mickelson, who's one of the great golfers of all time, and Ricky Fowler, he can be the guy who, you know, he's the guy who's kind of bristling with this intensity, and he's the guy who everybody's noticing because of his lack of interaction with everybody. Like it's impossible to not to notice the guy who's sitting there not interacting with anybody. But if you put him next to Tiger Woods, he defers to that other kind of personality in the whole thing. So
yeah, I think there always would have been that impression when things are going right for McIlroy, when he's playing brilliant on a final layer, winning a major, that you know, he has the icy stare. He is the scorpion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Like,
but the thing that does make it interesting, really interesting in places, and I thought the same thing last week, is most people who are really good at sport are interesting on some level. Like you find that people who devote themselves to achieving excellence at anything, be it sport or music or whatever, they've some part of their character that's very interesting. And the hardest thing is to get them to tell you that. And the reason that I'm sure that this is as bulksome as it is because Rory McIlroy is Irish, yes. He's a global superstar, yes. He's the #1 golfer of the world, yes. But he's actually willing to open up. And that kind of comes across in a big way because, you know, last week, like what's interesting is that Paul Kimmage tends to set the kind of boundaries for these interviews, which is a fair thing to achieve because you're relying on somebody doing you a favour in the first place by granting the interview. But I am disappointed that Paul didn't ask the one question last week that was the most pertinent, which was, why did it take the arrival of a journalist from the Sunday Independent for Rory McIlroy to realise that he needed toilet roll?
Someone gets it for him, surely.
Just how perfect is this guy?
We all wipe our arses. Couple of other bits I had picked out from that as well. I thought it was interesting actually when he was talking about round 2 at Portrush. One of the best experiences I've ever had on a golf course. People say, geez, what about the first round in Portrush? But it comes back to the amnesia Brandon was talking about. Yeah, the first round was terrible and I didn't want to remember that, but I'll remember the charge I made on Friday for the rest of my life, even though he didn't make the cut.
Yeah, you could tell it was actually very compelling watching him on the Friday.
It really was.
Because it wasn't flawless golf. It wasn't a case of this guy's back to his best because he made some poor shots, but then he got some birdies he maybe shouldn't have gotten. But you just wonder if it goes back to what Kieran says, that like to be as good as Rory McIlroy, you can't admit to yourself that you choked the first day. So what's your abiding memory of Portrush? It's the charge I made on the second day and fell within one shot of making the cut or whatever it was. Like it was a gutsy thing to do because you have to imagine that when McIlroy came off the course on the Thursday, he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him. Like, you know. And to come back and do it the way he did. And it was an incredible atmosphere there. I was on the way to vote yesterday and I was listening to they played it before, but they replayed it on RTE, which was Greg Allen's documentary about Shane Lowry winning the Open, and it was really good. But you actually get the sense of how raucous a golf tournament was there. So between McIlroy, you know, it was in Portrush. McIlroy didn't make the cut, had an awful first day, had a stirring second day, and then an Irishman won on the Sunday. Like it was, when we live through these things, I think in real time, we don't fully appreciate sort of, you know, how they kind of go down as some of the biggest Irish sporting events in history. And I think I think Portrush will, and I think that's why McIlroy chooses to remember much more quickly his run on the second day as opposed to what happened on the first, because. Like we played, it's hard to fully quantify how poor a shot in the first was because we played it a few weeks beforehand in a media open day, and somebody who Kieran didn't know quite well, who I won't mention, who plays off a handicap in the high 20s, hit the ball exactly where McIlroy did, and we laughed about how poor a shot it was in the pub that night. And I texted him at the end of the day, I said, "McIlroy's after putting his ball where you put yours," because there was a Portaloo there at the time when we were there. They hadn't built a grandstand. I said, "Geez, nobody's going to end up there in the first day." Turns out the tournament favourite put it exactly there.
Yeah, it's interesting the way he finishes up as well, Neil. I think when he goes into what Rory McIlroy calls fire and anger. What's anger ever done? It's not about getting angry, intimidating people on the tee. It's not like Novak Djokovic looking at Federer on the other side of the net. I'm not trying to intimidate Brooks Koepka. I'm focused on me. It's a criticism I had of myself in the past. I was overly emotional, impulsive and reactive. But Paul makes a good point there, that it wasn't some of that reaction anger, and didn't you often play great with that? Like, you could argue that when he was impulsive,
we were saying, like, you know, when he had the deadly stare, the ice in the veins.
Yeah, that he was winning majors then when he had that. But he talks about then, you know, he does say, "I've just had one of the best years of my career. The majors will come." He seems convinced to that. But there's a balance to be struck, and he mentions then, you know, just meeting his mother and father after a bad day and having a bad score, and they're still going to love me. It's, you know, it just strikes me he has more perspective now. And whether that's taken a slight edge off him is very debatable.
Yeah, that's
like, you would expect after the year he's had and go back to world number one, he's going to win more majors. But you wonder, he needs to win them soon, I think. You know, the longer it goes on and the longer it's mentioned, the longer it will weigh on him. Like, if it goes to 6th year, 7th year, 8th year, whatever. So this will be a big year, and with the Olympics as well, because I think if he got an Olympic gold, it would be...
changes the perception.
The thing about McIlroy is he always has the game to win it. Like, when he plays well, he hits it better than anybody ever hit it. So that's kind of the point about him. You can't... If he missed 10 cuts in a row, you couldn't be certain he's not going to win the Open the following week. You know, that's sort of the capabilities of his game. But that is, again, that's probably the other thing. The stuff I was talking about, one of the themes of the piece as to how he became a more sort of reflective Rory McIlroy in his own game. When we go into this, and there's a bit borrowed from the Sunday paper review on News Talk with Andy Dunn and John Malloy.
And Shane Keegan as well was in that day. And a little picture to go with it as well. I took the photo. I do remember, I actually remember that day. It was an FAI heavy day in the Sunday Times that day. I remember each and every one of them.
Yeah, but the purpose of that, of producing that, was to talk about maybe he has lost that age. Maybe that anger. Like, had he, you know, when he was going for his 5th major in 2015, had he shot 8 over par or 9 over par, or was it 80? Was it 8 over par on the first day of the Open in Portrush? There's no way he could be a sanguine about it now. Yeah. So I suppose what we're exploring here, what Paul Kimmage is exploring here, is yes, there has been a change in how he thinks about it, but is that for the better or is it for the worse?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Right. Will we move on to rugby reaction from yesterday? Yeah. So there's plenty of it. Obviously, Ireland far more impressive yesterday than they had been in the opening game against Scotland. Bonus point win against Wales. After we'd all talked up Wales a little bit, there were a few bits. Kieran, when you came in, I think both of us had actually read specifically around Johnny Sexton and the captaincy.
Yeah, what jumped out at me, the two pieces.
He showed something. It wasn't just like the signs we were seeing on the pitch, maybe the things were changing, but something we might have seen in Johnny Sexton that we'd been asking him, did he have, or not asking him, but we've been wondering, did he have the temperament maybe to take on the captaincy role and deal with the referees, because he has the narky trait in him. But there were a few things yesterday where you thought, you know what, maybe he actually has eased himself into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I find that interesting, because Neil Francis and Brendan Fanning are writing for the same paper, but both of them focus very much on Johnny Sexton and his leadership and the way he communicated with Roman Watt.
Who's a notoriously difficult man to communicate with.
Yeah. So, because... like Brendan, like a lot of people thought it wasn't the best call, making him captain, given he's 34, given you're starting another World Cup cycle, and people thought, you know, he's probably not going to be around for the next World Cup. It's very unlikely. You know, do you start again now, or do you look more short term? But Brendan makes the argument about how important he is. Farrell needs Sexton every bit as much as Sexton needs the fulfilment of top-class rugby. The captain will be central to moving the team forward. After yesterday's game, Sexton declared himself happy with Ireland's ability to put pressure back on Wales via their kicking game. But you wonder, was that related to the struggle to generate momentum when they have it? But just generally, like he scored all the points against Scotland. You know, he was very good yesterday. The way he communicated and his leadership now, like he's... Neil Francis touches on this. At one stage, Sexton said, Roman, they're stealing the breakdown. Can we have permission to go for the poach over the steal? The Frenchman almost gave his assent for that request. Wales had been stealing the breakdown all day and it was almost impossible to go for the poach. It was brilliant from Sexton, who's learning nicely the nuances of being captain. Because interesting, I watched the highlights again last night after being at the game, and Alan Quinlan mentioned at some stage in the commentary that's where you need a forward as captain.
And that's what so many people have been saying.
Yeah, he picked out some incident.
It was. I remember it was a maul.
Yeah,
Ireland got a good maul going towards the line. Talupa Falato came around and like just completely pull it down to the ground.
Right, yeah,
Wales got the turnover.
But that struck me that that there is this thing out there that he's the wrong fit as captain.
Yeah.
But both Neil Francis and Brendan Fanning have made a case today why he's a very, very good fit for basically for ground zero for this team.
Yeah.
You know?
It's interesting too, but like the whole thing about Sexton and making him captain, and that, you know, I'm sure when he's on the pitch and not captain, he seems to have that kind of narky, almost bristling presence there. But because of the very unique situation in rugby where it's the only player who can talk to the referee, you know, if he has permission to do that directly to the referee and the referee has to receive him, maybe whether it's an inadvertent benefit to Ireland or it's one that they calculated in the first place, like maybe it's worth him having that sort of direct communication, because he seems to be one of these players who's almost calculating what's going on as it comes along, and he can articulate it quite quickly rather than a forward coming off the bottom of a ruck looking around at the referee and putting his hands out and saying, what's that for? Like he's almost sort of analysing the play as it goes forward and trying to, I suppose, tip the slight vagaries of the rules in Ireland's favour.
Yeah, and even the way he was phrasing things to referees, like I'd go back to, it was summer 2018 when they were in Australia, and Sexton had to slot in as captain midway through a game because Rory Best had gone off or he wasn't playing, I can't remember. And there was a moment, I can't remember who the referee was, but he started by saying to him, it was along the lines of, I know you don't like me, but I'm the captain now. And like that was never going to work out well. Whereas yesterday, for example, Brendan Fanning leads with, can I ask just one question? Far better way to approach things, you know. Other good bits, I thought Dennis Walsh made a few good points on it as well, actually. Just Ireland's performance against Scotland had been a false start for the new coach, but the mood around the national team had been so polluted by last year of Joe Schmidt's reign that patience was scarce. So even though they tried a few things last week, there was just this impression that they just weren't trying enough new things.
There seems to be in the case, and I wasn't there or anything, but I know people who were, and they said that the atmosphere before the game was very, very poor. That there was no great sense of drama.
Before yesterday's game?
I do think in general...
the 1 o'clock kick, or the early kick-offs, there's always a terrible atmosphere, I think. It does impact because...
people are slow coming in.
And they haven't had enough drink in time, to be blunt.
Was there as... Like, the Ireland-Wales rivalry has obviously been a big thing over the last decade or whatever, but it didn't seem to be...
There weren't as much media grenades during the week.
During the week, no, it didn't feel as tense going into the game, and maybe it was a lack of expectation on Ireland's part.
And Morgan Gatland isn't
there.
Well,
like Gatland was brilliant for that.
He was just the grenade.
Yeah, he was absolutely fantastic. There was another point I think Neil Francis had made. He says, it is, however, still Joe Schmidt's game plan. There's a little bit more lateral movement, a fraction more adventure, and a nod to Jordan Larmour granting himself licence to do whatever he wants. I would actually say that there's nothing wrong with that at all. Joe Schmidt's game plan, in theory, was actually quite good. It just needed to be a little bit more adventurous here and there. And if that's the way it's going, and if that's the way it pans out, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it.
No, and South Africa won the World Cup with a game plan that wasn't particularly adventurous. Like, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can't say 100%. Everything that happened the last couple of years was wrong, you know, straight away. So, yes, we all want a bit more offloading and adventure and flair, but you have to keep the good parts of Schmidt's tenure as well, I think so.
Well, I think the other thing as well, like Ireland have been so sort of successful. They've done everything on the spectrum when it comes to the Six Nations over the last 10 years. So, like, to get people really interested, you have to do something different. Like, if you go up, if Ireland won a very grinding sort of a victory, 12-3, and all the points come from the boot and all the rest of it yesterday, I think people would be happy enough with the win. But are they engaged by it?
I think it was along the lines of last week. People were kind of going, okay, look, we got the win, but...
Like, any time a new manager comes in, people always hope that there's going to be some sort of change, some sort of thing that'll engage them a little bit more, you know. And when rugby's played, sort of the way Ireland tried to play it in the World Cup, and even the way South Africa played it successfully in the World Cup, it's not going to attract too many of the floating voters, I don't think.
No, definitely not.
I think there is a factor as well that when the home games are England, France, there's a bit more of a buzz. I think people generally expect to win the Scotland-Italy game. I know the Wales record hasn't been great recently.
There's a game less. It's the two games that you absolutely want the ticket for.
Yeah.
You know, there's going to be tickets. If you want to get a ticket for the Italy game, if you try hard enough, you'll probably find one.
Yeah.
If it's a France and England, you're going to struggle to get it.
Absolutely. In like 2 weeks' time, Ireland are going to Twickenham for Triple Crown. And if that game was here, you know, it'd still be a big buzz.
Yeah.
Like, it'd still be a big deal, especially because England have been very up and down. So it looks like a winnable game. But you would like that in Dublin now, just because it does seem a little bit flat for the World Cup. And generally, there is a World Cup hangover. If you look at Ireland's post-World Cup seasons, only one of them really has been decent. Like, generally, they've struggled in World Cup. So far, this one has been quite positive. I know last week wasn't a great performance, but this has been positive. You're going to have minimum 3 wins, which is probably... Is that the minimum you would have wanted from this campaign, 3 wins?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
I think going into it in my head, I was thinking 3. I wasn't even prepared to make a call on the France game until 3 or 4 matches into the tournament, because, like, it's cliche. God knows what France were going to throw up. Like, absolute. Because if they're in contention for a title going into that last game, that's going to be incredibly tough. But at the same time, France could end up have losing 3 of their first 4. And then that's a write-off for them. But
okay.
So that's the match reaction. It was just kind of general reaction, really. Like, you know, a lot better than last week. There was a good story in the Sunday Times. Unfortunately,
this is interesting. Yeah, because just to show, well, if there's anybody watching, there's a little blurb on page 5. Do you hold it up like that? Yeah, there's a little blurb for a Finn Russell interview, who was such a massive story ahead of the Six Nations because he was Scotland's star player and left the squad in strange circumstances. But you'd wonder, because a very interesting interview, you'd wonder why he's not in the main paper. And I think if you do look at the paper, you know, you've got 2 pages in Ireland's Wales, so there's not much room there. The next 2 pages are dominated.
There are a couple of big ads in there.
Yeah, dominated by 2 massive ads.
The ads have to have their space, I suppose.
Yeah, and you have to pay the bills, and Scotland, England's there. So there just wasn't space, because that's basically been the allocation for rugby. But it's a shame it didn't go into the paper, because it's, like you mentioned before we went on air, Neil, that it was a kind of echoes of Saipan to you.
Absolutely.
And to me, it has echoes of Saipan, because ultimately Saipan was a story of drink.
Yeah, but it's even the characters and the bullishness of them. And okay, it's not on the same scale, because it wasn't, you know, a few weeks before a World Cup in soccer, which is so much bigger even as well, and it's probably not getting as much traction as Saipan did here over in Scotland, but it's just because there are parallels. Yeah,
because this is part. No, the final bust of, you know, is centred on a few drinks that Finn Russell came back from a game and came into camp, and he's part of the leadership group. And the leadership group had decided they could have 2 pints each, or 2 drinks each.
They had decided this the day before, because a lot of them were with Edinburgh and Glasgow. They had arrived into camp on the Saturday night. Finn Russell was playing on the Sunday with Racing, so he arrived in on the Sunday evening. So it's Mark Palmer of the Sunday Times is chatting to Finn Russell. Mark would have been on our Saturday panel last week, actually, before the Ireland-Scotland game. And it's Finn Russell essentially putting his version out there, setting the record straight, that this wasn't just about he had a drink too many and missed training the following day.
Just as well,
this had been something that was bubbling for a while.
My perception of this was
Keane McCarthy.
Yeah, that it was Finn Russell was inside in the bar in the hotel singing Flower of Scotland at 4 o'clock in the morning.
While everyone else on his head or something.
Yeah, while everyone else was upstairs.
Scotsmen don't wear jugs.
But I suppose the problem that Finn Russell has here, it's very obvious that the relationship that he had with Scottish management wasn't, like with Gregor Townsend in particular, wasn't good. That they both had 2 different ideas about how players should, I don't know if behave too strong a word, but he was talking Russell's views on the environment here, and he spoke about it, the contrast being Racing, the club that he plays for in France. He says, a club where players are expected to take a lead in determining the approach on and off the pitch, and are trusted to spend their own time doing what works for them. The Scotland setup Russell describes sounds highly controlled and comparatively joyless. And that's really interesting because rugby...
Can I just say, actually, it's worth noting that line, the Scottish setup Russell describes sounds highly controlled and comparatively joyless. It's well known and well bandied about that Gregor Townsend has always been a huge Joe Schmidt fan and has modelled his not just style of play but way of managing almost around that as well. So that actually jumps out as well.
Yeah,
but go on.
It's rugby is always held aloft as the kind of model for how players are allowed
enjoy the beer after a game. Yeah,
and that seems to be a very important thing. And GAA players always bring it up because it has become in vogue over the last few years for GAA teams at county level to invoke drinks bans 4 months before the players have to play a game of any significance whatsoever. But Finn Russell says here again about racing, they treat you like an adult. You know, if you start coming late in for training or going out during the week, that's when it's a problem. The whole situation with Scotland has been made about me wanting to have a drink when in actual fact it was about control, respect and trust on and off the pitch.
There was one line actually that jumped out hugely. It was the morning after, so basically he had arrived in camp, he'd been told he had 2 drinks, and then when he went to order the third, he'd been told the leadership group decided it was one more, and he was arguing, like, I've had a match today, I want to have a beer, whatever. And he had a meeting with Gregor Townsend on the Monday after having missed training and been told he wasn't going to be considered for selection. It says then, Townsend arranged for him to see a psychologist on the Tuesday. For Russell, the message was that his Scotland bosses believe he has an alcohol problem.
Yeah, well, it strikes me, this jumped out at me as well, Neil, and like you mentioned that he's a big fan, Gregor Townsend is a big fan of Joe Schmidt. And I think it's actually a problem with rugby coaches is that they're too much into micromanaging. Yeah. And that to try and tackle every aspect or control every aspect of players' lives. And, you know, even in a playing sense, Finn Russell mentioned a lot of our game plan last year revolved around stats and kicking. And for me, that's not rugby. Just play the game. Like, there's a lot of things the coaches want to tell you what to do in every single second of a game, the way every play should pan out, etc. And if you look around rugby, like I look at the way Simon Zebo, what happened with Simon Zebo, or say the way Gavin Henson's career went in Wales, or Danny Cipriani in England, that guys that are and Finn Russell now, that guys who are a bit off kilter, a bit of a maverick spirit, that a lot of modern coaches find it very hard to handle, or they don't know how to handle it because they don't fit into the boxes that most of the guys are happy to walk into. And I think there needs to be more compromise, because you do look at the Scotland team and you think with Finn Russell they might well have beaten England yesterday. You know,
on paper they have a squad as good as, I'd say, like, capable of beating anyone in the Six Nations, definitely.
Yeah. There's another
on the kind of micromanagement you're saying, it actually goes back, there was a line Dennis Walsh used in his piece. Under Schmidt, creativity also seemed to be rehearsed. It's along those lines, isn't it? That, like, you know, you can play what's ahead of you, but only if you know it's one of these 3 options or something like that.
Well, I think most managers as well want to, again, it's a control thing, and we see it in all sort of elite level sports. You see it with Pep Guardiola, with the way Manchester City play, you know, they have to have 15 passes before the thing is set up properly and they can unleash their moves. And you can see a huge amount of Gaelic football, and increasingly hurling even, is like pre-rehearsed moves, like almost like American football stuff. But the thing about that is, you know, coaches can then break it down in analysis and say, well, okay, did we try and do the right thing? If we didn't do the right thing, was there a poor decision made? Okay, it's the player's fault. If we tried to do the right thing, what cost us? Was it poor execution or whatever? So there's almost a fear on the part of the coaches to relinquish control, because if you're handing it over to the players and saying, you trust your instinct and your skills, well, you're not really in control of it anymore. Like if Finn Russell has a bad day, if he has a meltdown, whatever it might be, you have to stand there and say, well, I picked him and I didn't give him close enough instructions. So I think that's probably, I think because so much of modern elite sport is kind of pre-rehearsed moves, and largely game plans are prescribed from on high and rehearsed endlessly until it becomes, you know, second nature. You could do it blindfolded. Yeah. The problem with players like Finn Russell, who has an issue with how the team play, is like it's going to come up. It's a red flag straight away. You know?
Yeah, because it's interesting. If you look at the way Liverpool's success under Jurgen Klopp, like they are incredibly well coached, and you can see the coaching in them, that they've maybe 3 distinctive ways of playing: the pressing game, the possession game, and then they use long balls quite a lot as well. So they were kind of more one-dimensional a couple of years ago, but now if one thing isn't working, they try another, or they try them all at different points of the game. But it's interesting here, I heard Jurgen Klopp talk about this a couple of times. He said the best thing he's ever seen in football, the biggest wow moment he ever saw, was Trent Alexander's corner
against Barcelona.
Against Barcelona, they set up Origi's goal, where, you know, he looked like he was walking away, let somebody else take it, cut back, kicked it in. Barcelona weren't ready, and that was pure off the cuff. That wasn't coached. He'd never been told to do that in training, Alexander Arnold, and he embraced that, Klopp. Like, you have to allow players to take the initiative as well. You know, that's part of coaching, that players are allowed to call something themselves, that it can't all be control.
And I was thinking of that yesterday. I was watching the England-Scotland game, which, if anyone didn't watch it, don't bother. It was atrocious. The weather conditions in Murrayfield were absolutely brutal. Howling wind and all the rain as well to go on top of it. And, like, it ties in with the players aren't given the opportunity to make up their own minds. In the second half in particular, there was probably a 10-minute period where England kept opting to box kick, kicking it out on the full, having to come all the way back for a Scottish line out. Scotland players then started kicking it out in the full. And I was watching on the BBC, and Brian Moore and the commentators there as well, I think it was, I can't remember who else was there, but they were saying, like, you know, the conditions are awful. That's half an excuse, but if the conditions are awful and you know they're awful, stop sending those kicks up when you know they're going to get caught into it. And you know it's not the right thing to do, but it's just conditioned into them. This is how we play. And there was just another bit in this that I thought was interesting from an Irish rugby point of view. It's nearly part of the reason, I'd say, why the IRFU are so strict on only picking players based here. He's talking about how the leadership group had decided, again, it was just those 2 beers, and then after the England game they would have a big night out and they can cut loose a bit. But what he's saying is, it's also the case that that a night out after England is fine for the boys employed by the SRU, who will have the next week off. But for me and some of the other boys, we'll be back playing for our clubs the following week in France. I know it can't be changed for one person, but at least if we get a say at the time, we can come to an agreement. So, like, you know, they don't have control over it. They're going back to play with their clubs. The guys employed by the Scottish Rugby Union, they have the week off next week. That's a fair point. And it actually just reminds me of, you know, the Andy Reid, Giovanni Trapattoni. It's about how that ended, because I was at that game in Mainz in Germany. And what actually happened was that there was a sing-song, and Andy had his guitar out and leading the sing-songs as he does. But Trapattoni or Tardelli, on his behalf, I can't remember, called, you know, last drink. You know, that's it. You know, that's it. Last drink. We're going up. And to Irish people who hear last drink, they go to the bar. They order two pints or 3 pints, and they meant last drink. You finish the one you have in front of you. So that led to.
But it's funny,
lost in translation.
Just on the subject of drink and bans and control and thing, and I think it has to do. You get the sense from the interview with Finn Russell that he's not a guy who likes to be constrained by things that he doesn't think are worthwhile constraints. And I remember meeting a player on the night of a drawn All-Ireland final, and the replay was going to be 2 weeks later, and he was having a drink, and I never passed any comment, but I met him again subsequently. I said, what was the rule about that? I assume, like, you know, you're banned from drinking 6 months before a league game, so like 2 weeks before the All-Ireland final replay. And he says, no, he says, we have a system in-house where there's no drinks banned. You can drink whenever you want, like, that's your own thing. But it's like everything that you do is already attuned towards your next training session. Are you going to perform there? And players knew themselves that if they pushed the boat out too much with regard to having a drink the wrong night or too many drinks on a given night, that they weren't going to give their best in training. That was going to be detected, that they were going to do themselves harm, and they were going to do the team no good. So essentially what you were doing was you weren't putting any restrictions in, like the psychological restriction of you can't drink.
Immediately you want to have a drink.
It became this, you do what you want for the best of yourself and the team. And it has the same effect. Generally speaking, the players aren't going to drink anyway, but it just means that it feels like the player isn't being empowered to make the choice for themselves and the team. And you'd imagine that is a much better way to do it, rather than, you know, limiting the number of drinks or giving a prescribed level of alcohol consumption.
Here's your 2 drink tokens.
How big can the drink be? Like, you know?
Right, will we move on from the rugby?
Yeah, sure,
There's plenty of other bits and pieces. I'll give you a few options. Cork football, Dennis Walsh on getting minorities involved in GA.
I think that's the minorities one. I think that was good.
It's a really interesting piece.
Dennis Walsh in the Sunday Times.
It's a really, really interesting piece about the GAA's ability, or I suppose they've been, not that the GAA has necessarily been slow, but
it's just an untapped resource.
It says up at the top here, GAA have to work harder to reach out to immigrant communities as a source of players and supporters. And it's a fair point because, as Dennis says in the last census, sorry, I had the figure here, the number of non-Irish nationals living here is more than 535,000. And the level of engagement in GAA clubs isn't anywhere near what it should be. And it's interesting because, like, I'm 36 and I was probably the first generation of people who went to school with people from different backgrounds, from different countries. And I assumed that at this stage we would have had plenty of people from different backgrounds playing inter-county football and hurling and winning All-Irelands, and it hasn't happened.
There are a few.
And like
just a few.
And like part of the reason that Jason Sherlock was such a phenomenon was the same reason that Sean O'Halpin was such a phenomenon. On top of their sporting prowess, they were different. Like, they represented something different, and people were really, really interesting. But it kind of goes back to a thing that I've always felt. I remember being in here one day talking about, you know, the role of women in the GAA and how come the women generally do what are considered women's roles, you know, and men do what are considered men's roles, the coaching and the big stuff. But it always struck me that the GAA, because it's such a big organisation, and it's not really a sporting organisation, it's a cultural organisation, and it reflects Irish society far more than it can ever sort of project onto Irish society. So, you know, you can always put in place gender quotas for county boards and coaching and these sort of things. But so long as they're the roles that women generally have taken up in Irish society in the past, they're the roles that are going to tend to fall in the GAA. It's kind of a, you know, like, it will take society to kind of catch up. And I think it's the same with regard to integration of people from immigrant communities in Ireland. You know, if people aren't as integrated in their community, they're not as inclined to be integrated in their GAA club. Because that has always been the relationship between Irish people and the GAA club. Yes, it's a place to go to play or support a team, but it's also a community aspect as well. And I think what it probably needs, like the point is made here by Tony Watney, it's not until you see a whole load of players from immigrant communities playing inter-county that it might spark an interest. Because I think, and it's hard to know, but, you know, by 2011, another statistic here, the number of Poles living in Ireland had grown to over 122,000. 5 years later, in the next census, that number had changed by just 70. But it says for the GAA, the Polish community in particular has been barren ground. So why is it, like, you know, it's not a case of a few families aren't interested in Gaelic football or hurling. Here is a huge sample size that haven't been engaged by the local GAA club. And it obviously needs some sort of policy shift or some sort of programme at a high level to be filtered down to clubs before that changes.
I think there's a wider thing as well. Like, I just focus on Dublin for a moment. Like, there's obviously, because Dublin's population and the amount of work here, there's more people from immigrant communities in Dublin than anywhere else. And a few years ago, under Pat Gilroy, Craig Dias was the first black player to play for Dublin. And I always thought it was very positive that there was no comment made about it. Like, nobody actually said, oh, this is the first black guy to play for Dublin, you know, whereas maybe 10 years earlier, a lot would have been made of it. And he only played for a brief, couple of years. He ended up with an All-Ireland medal off the bench, I think. But I wonder now, like, I did a piece a few weeks ago on the story, you know, of Dublin GA between the canals, you know, in the city centre.
Hardly a set of posts between them.
So, like, there's 116,000 people live between the canals, but only 2 players from there have played for Dublin senior footballers championship since 1966, Paddy Cullen and Ger Brennan. But it's interesting, 1 in 5 between the canals are non-nationals. You know, so, which is a very high percentage. Also, a huge amount of non-nationals live in West Dublin, which is another GA wasteland. Like, it's the GA, like John Costello in Purnell Park will tell you that it's an area that need more clubs, an area that struggle to make a big impact. That a lot of people, immigrants, have settled in areas that the GA are struggling in to make an impact. And
the campaign to give Dublin extra funding to support isn't the most universally popular one.
So what you're saying, Kieran, is the all-conquering Dublin are underperforming.
No, but
they need more money.
No, I'm only joking. I know what you mean.
Dublin does have a lot of problems. Like, it's like land is a massive one. But, like, I look at things that GA does at central level. like GA, as a Clonliffe College,
Yeah.
you call that, like they spent 92 million, I think, on a site that's nearly 20 acres, and there's going to be a hotel there, there's going to be, I think, 1,200 apartments, and they say there'll be some sporting and recreational activities, but there's no room for pitches in the city centre, and you think a complex like that could transform the GA in the city centre, and it's something Paul Rouse, the UCD historian, has talked about before. He thinks the GA have just abandoned the inner cities. They thought there's no point doing anything with it, that it's easy just to say there's no land, there's nowhere we can put pitches, but there's a lot of derelict sites that you could turn around and make. If the will is there,
even half pitches.
The Trinity cricket pitch.
Balls.
The Trinity cricket pitch would be a great GA pitch.
Well, John Costello made a point in one of his reports a few years ago that NAMA had a sort of an ethical responsibility, a sort of a community responsibility to sell some of the assets that they had to GAA clubs. So that, you know, okay, you're not making the money back, but, you know, NAMA technically shouldn't be a money-making operation. It should have some sort of social conscience about what they do with the assets that they have. And it never really got off the ground. But as we were saying beforehand, and this is only anecdotal evidence, but when you go to Croke Park to cover a game, and at half-time the Common and Munskill children are on the pitch, there are any number of children, more children with names that don't sound Irish than names that sound Irish, of different ethnic backgrounds, of different colours and creeds. But when it comes to senior inter-county level and even senior club level in most counties, those players aren't still participating. So something is happening along the way, and it's hard to figure out exactly what that is. But you would imagine it is something to do with the kind of culture of GAA clubs, how they interact with their community, and whether they can kind of expand that.
Yeah, and role models as well, I think. You know, because if the role models aren't there, like if you're a young black kid here, you can look at all the black people who played soccer for Ireland over the years, and you can aspire to be in that. You look around the GA and it looks basically 99.9999% white, and it always has been. And, you know, that can be a little bit off-putting, I would think.
He does...
he likes me standing out. You know,
Dennis Walsh does kind of finish on a nice little story of Longford. Longford's a shining example. According to the last census, only about 2/3 of the town population were born in Ireland. More than 3,000 of the town's residents indicated a language other than English as their first. So Longford Slashers GA Club embraced the changed reality and, with help from outside agencies, drilled into the new communities. By 2015, half of their under-12 panel were from non-Irish backgrounds, encompassing 7 different nationalities. Last year, a Longford Slashers player with 2 Russian parents made the county minor team, along with a boy who was born in Romania as well. So, as you were kind of saying, maybe at the younger age, there is a good effort being put in, there is good engagement, but it's what's happening when they get to the late teens, into the, you know, the minor age groups and under 21s.
Yeah, because like when you're a parent, you know, if you're a parent from Romania or you're a parent from Russia in this situation, and you're like, you know, your kids are taking up some sort of sporting interest,
quickest way to help them make friends and things like that as well.
But like if you're not prone towards any sporting organisation, like, you know, you wouldn't have any problem sending them to the GA, but you wouldn't be naturally more inclined to send them to the GA. But it seems to be what happens once those children get to the level where they make their own decisions as to what sports they tend to gravitate towards.
Yeah, and it's far easier to gravitate towards soccer. Like I live near Fairview Park, and if you walk past there on a Sunday, like I see some of the, like there might be just kind of kickabout games, like just groups among themselves, but I see people wearing Nepal jerseys or Indian jerseys or Bangladesh, or they're from all over, because the soccer is the universal global game. So if people do settle here from abroad and their kids, they're much more comfortable with soccer because they've grown up with it, they understand it. The GA, if you've come into it and never seen it before, it's a bit strange.
Yeah.
Like it's very, very different, and it's you can see why they go with what they're more comfortable, what the parents would feel more comfortable with, I think.
Right.
Okay.
We're 5-2. Probably time for 2 more stories.
2 more stories.
Just a column
each. Who wants to go?
I'll take Shane McGran, the Mail.
Talking about Colm O'Rourke, is it?
Yeah, it's talking about Colm O'Rourke, but it's also talking about RT's response to what Colm O'Rourke said last week. Now, so on the Allianz League Sunday programme, Colm O'Rourke was referring to, I think it was the black card for...
Was it the red card in the Mayo game, or am I wrong?
Sorry, it was the red card in the Mayo game. Yeah, for the hit on John Small, and he said that if that was the proportionate punishment, Gaelic football would be a namby-pamby-pansy boy game. And as Shane says, there is no suggestion that Colm O'Rourke is a homophobe, but nor is there any situation where the use of such language is acceptable. he doesn't really labour on the point of what Colin O'Rourke's saying not being an acceptable thing to say, because I think most people will agree with that.
Yeah, it kind of goes without saying almost.
The point that he gets to, and this is interesting, it's also, he makes this point as well, sorry, which I find interesting, is that we always, and particularly in hurling you hear this use of the phrase manliness as being very virtuous, you know, great manliness shown out there on the pitch. And sometimes that can be a euphemism for people breaking rules, like, you know, and hitting people head high and going over the top.
See with rugby as well, like the Eddie Jones stuff talking about
exactly
you
that.
know, brutality and things like that.
But it comes to RTE's response here, because obviously David Goff, who was an openly gay, very prominent refereed last year's All-Ireland drawn final from Meath, he raised Conor O'Rourke's comments immediately on Twitter, and he said the response from RTE when the Mail inquired about whether Colin O'Rourke would be on tonight's programme was that he wouldn't be, but that was because of scheduling. And as for the second question, which was whether they considered it an acceptable thing for Colin O'Rourke to say, what they said to him was that David Goff and Colin O'Rourke had been in touch privately over the matter, and they considered the matter closed, which is fine, but like
David Goff isn't the only person who...
David Goff's not the only person who might be offended to that. And by not having any sort of public statement from O'Rourke, and I don't want to hang Colin O'Rourke over this because it's clearly just a slip of the tongue, and I don't think it probably represents, you know, obviously his best analytical work, but like, for RTE to kind of just gloss over it, it nearly reminds me of the time that Jim Gavin was asked by Colin Parkinson about the incident with Davy Byrne, and he just kept saying, well, look, like a double player ended
frank discussion or something, was it?
Yeah, it was like a double player ended up seriously injured because of an incident that happened in a challenge match, and he said, well, the two players have spoken to each other, they got it off the chest, and now we're all ready to move on. And it kind of leaves it very unresolved, because like a wrong has been done here on somebody's watch, and it's not just between those two parties. No, and the somebody's watch here is RTE, and a simple statement saying that they don't condone blah blah blah, and it's, you know we'll speak to about the matter. It would have cleared it up in an awful lot more convenient or sort of satisfactory way than simply saying that Colin O'Rourke has been in touch with David Goff. The two lads have had it out between them, and we're kind of moving on here, because you know, I think it's important to take a stronger stance on something like that, because if, you know, we are in the age of people taking offence, but I think people who take offence to this have every right to be offended by it, because it wasn't a good use of language, and I don't think RTE's response has been, and as Shane says, this is not about trying to silence Colin O'Rourke, but rather properly addressing a controversy that illuminates an important issue. It has also raised the question of what should be tolerated in sporting discussion. Many welcome sport as an escape from life's regular grueling concerns, but it must abide by the standards that generally prevail too. And I think that's a sentiment that nearly everybody can get on board with. And I think what's probably most confusing about RTE's lack of comment on it is he obviously highlights a few weeks ago on RT Radio 1, Tom Parlin was talking about political negotiations on radio last week. He was part of the Progressive Democrats team discussing coalition government with Fianna Fáil. He said on Today with Sean O'Rourke on RT Radio 1 and recalled how his side fought like tinkers in a futile attempt to reach agreement. Less than 2 minutes after he said that, O'Rourke noted Parlin's use of a term that was a bit loose, and before closing the show, the host apologised for the use of an unfortunate phrase, with a contrite Parlin saying he would take it back entirely. Like, you know, they were able to deal with that. Yeah, but they also, like Joe Brolly, and I know Joe spoke a lot last week, or the week before, around the time that he agreed to be an air pundit, but he basically said, like, he was, okay, his interpretation, he was sacked over RTE said that his contract was up for renewal and they never renewed it. But he was rebuked for whatever he said to Pat Spillane that day, and it was far less offensive than what this potentially can cause. So yeah, well, I think that's actually might explain partly why there hasn't been any real public comment from RT, because I think RT Sport does feel a bit under siege, because Brawley made a lot of accusations in the series interviews he did when he joined Air. It looks like Treacy Piggott is finishing up with RT Sport. Robert Hall has finished. There's been a lot of change, and you know, the likes of Eamon Dunphy when they left have been very critical of them. So I think the
they do feel like they're a target now, or maybe the head of sport, Declan McBennett, feels that he's been people are zoning in on him, and also, there's a lot of cutbacks coming down the lines across the board in RT. So, but what Conor McKeon said, you can't say it wasn't a David Goff issue. Like, people to focus too much on David Goff's reaction or Conor Cusack's reaction. Like, it's easy to brush it off and say, oh, you can't say anything these days, or is PC gone mad, or the usual stupid cliches. But it's easy to say that if you're straight. But if you're a gay kid hearing that, it's harder to hear and it's harder to stomach, and it shouldn't be acceptable. And it's very easy just to come straight out and say, it wasn't acceptable, I shouldn't have said it, I'm sorry. And that should be the end of it. And that's what should have happened.
Right, well.
Just a very quick one, because we're finishing.
We've time for one more.
Eamon Sweeney on the back page of the Sunday Indo. But it goes into, it was highlighted a lot during the week. Basketball Ireland issued a statement about what happened to them a few years ago when they got into financial difficulties.
Far less financial difficulty
than the FAI. And their international teams had to be disbanded. They were deprived of sports capital grants for years. When players did start playing international football or basketball again, they had to raise the money themselves to go on trips abroad, etc. And basically, he makes the argument that the big sporting bodies are treated differently, like the GA, the FAI, rugby to an extent, that the other sporting bodies, like I thought when this happened, Shane Ross announced this is going to cause a lot of problems, that there'll be a lot of other sporting bodies out there and saying the FAI has been an absolute basket case, and like what has gone on has been disgraceful and could end up in court, and you're giving them a load of money. And that's the way people say it. And I know the argument is there and it's a valid one. There's safeguarding jobs and people that aren't getting in well-paid jobs even, that you're looking after
like the
them.
Biggest sporting body in the country.
And you can make the argument that a bailout was needed. But at the same time, other sports are saying, we are not being treated the same way. And Eamon makes the point that we need to make the sporting landscape more diverse. And that's something that I've always thought, like there's too much focus on the first 2 or 3 sports. Like I think there's 70 or 80 sports under the auspices of Sport Ireland. I know, and there are a lot of people. They're looking after a hell of a lot of people all over the country. And sports with the volunteers, which are only some sports, the way they go on, you think they're the only sports of volunteers. Every sport is volunteers. And a lot of them now are going to be going to the next Minister of Sport, who doesn't look like Shane Ross going to invite today, and going to be saying, we want a bit of this largesse as well.
It's a fair point as well, because the 3 big sporting organisations on this island, the FAI, the RFU and the GAA, there's nearly, and always has been, kind of when it comes to a funding model, being this sort of effort on the part of governments to make sure that they're all kind of kept happy. Because if you keep those 3 happy, you're keeping the majority of the sporting interested people in this country on side. You're not showing any preference to one over the other. But it's hard to know. Like, I think Basketball Ireland are absolutely right to raise their concerns and to highlight their own case, because it's been going on for a long while and they clearly haven't been a high priority. But because of what happened in the FAI, because of the sort of factors that are highlighted in this article as to how poorly the organisation was managed, the situation that it found itself in, they're kind of making Eamon Sweeney's kind of making the argument here, well, they don't deserve this. But the alternative is unimaginable. Like, you can't let the FAI go to the wall. So you either bail them out or you don't bail them out. But in doing so, they've obviously left themselves very, very vulnerable to this, because you can tell, people who are really interested in athletics as well, and they see, grants to GAA players in an organisation that the revenue is whatever it is, that galls them, it really does. And you create this kind of bad vibe between sports in this country, which, I don't think is probably good. Yeah, but
you just look at the general election campaign that's just ended. Health naturally was mentioned a hell of a lot. I didn't hear anybody mention sport in any of their manifestos or any of the debates. And there's a very strong link between health and sport. That's why, sport deserves far more funding than it gets. Because eventually, a fitter population means there's less pressure in the hospitals. There's no, you can't get away from that.
The problem is it's very long term,
people that don't want to.
If you have a minister that will come in, you are being held to your election promises. You are being You know, you have to show quick results, and there's no point saying because we've made PE a compulsory 3 times a week thing, in 20 years' time the health system is going to be in far better order.
But sometimes you have to look at the big picture. Like you look at, Donogh O'Malley, like bringing in free education, which was the biggest, it's the most transformative move ever made in Irish politics. And like he didn't see the benefits of that during his lifetime as a politician. So sometimes you have to look at the big picture, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose basketball probably is one of those interesting cases where commercially it's not a huge sport in Ireland, but participation levels, it's quite big.
Yeah, well, like I know, like I come from a very remote part of Donegal, and we all played basketball in school. Like basketball was huge at schools level, and that's the same all over Ireland. Like it's I would say I'd like to see the figures for teenagers, because I would say secondary school students, basketball must be very, very high.
It has to be more than rugby, does it, in the country?
I'd say so.
Comfortably.
I would say so, yeah.
In terms of participation rates, absolutely.
Yeah, that would be, I'd be guessing, but I would be confident in guessing. So that's where we'll leave it for now.
Okay.
There were a couple of other interesting bits, I suppose just quick mentions. The idea of Premflix.
Oh, yeah.
Don't worry, that mic isn't live. You didn't blow up the studio or anything.
Yeah.
So the idea of Premflix, the Premier League launching their own kind of rights service where you can get everything you want in one go. Other little bits. You mentioned Paul Kerrigan, good interview in the Sunday Times with Mick Foley, and they were the main bits that jumped out for us anyway. And also
there's an interesting piece
of
with Jonathan Northcroft on Pep Guardiola in the Sunday Times. Basically, he's gone into the lack of trust he has in young players. You know, the likes of Phil Foden, who has been talked of as the next English superstar for about 4 years now. I know, and they've got 13 games left, and they're having a hope of winning the league now. So why aren't these fellas been thrown in rather than David Silva, who's leaving the end of the season, or Gundogan, or all the talk is of he's going to buy 5 or 6 superstars in the summer, but he has this academy that everyone says is brilliant. Why don't these kids get a chance now?
Yeah.
Because he has this reputation of improving players. Well, show it now. Put in a Phil Foden, give him 12 games in a row, and see how you can improve Phil Foden over 12 games instead of giving him 5 minutes once a month.
Mm-hmm. There's one more thing, just
one honourable mention.
Colin O'Rourke's column today. He's talking about basically. It's kind of like every year somebody does the piece of the transfer system in the GAA and what could every county do. But he's basically saying of the All-Ireland contenders, which of the Dublin players they could do with most. And he talks about how Dublin, people talk about a lot of factors when it comes to Dublin, but the thing that defines them is that their skill set is much higher. But the only reason I bring it up was I think he probably wrote it towards the end of last night's game against Monaghan rather than at half-time when they were 9 points down. So I think he'd narrowly dodged the bullet there.
Right, Conor, Kieran, thanks a million for coming in this afternoon and joining us. As I say, no show on Off the Ball this afternoon, but this paper review, if you only caught the end of it, maybe it's going to be podcast a little bit later on. You can watch it back on all of our social channels as well. And Off the Ball will be back as normal tomorrow evening from 7 o'clock, and we'll have the paper review back again next Sunday. Thanks for watching.